Hi everyone, this is Rooster Woodworking, and this week we are building a cabinet from scrap plywood and going over 5 woodworking skills you can improve doing scrap projects, including catching furniture with your head. Over the past few months, I've accumulated quite a bit of scraps from different plywood projects. And because my shop space is pretty limited, I try not to hold on to the scraps for too long. Thankfully, there is a very awkward space in my house that would require some additional storage in the form of a cabinet, and that would be the perfect scrap project. In addition to clearing space in your shop and being basically free, scrap projects are also a great way to improve your woodworking skills. Today we're going to talk about 5 skills you can improve working on scraps. The first skill for me is going from measurements to a quick drawing to actually building the thing within a short amount of time. When working on design for a client, I tend to over-design everything in 3D and the smallest detail before making a single cut. And that's a valid way to go about it, but I don't think it always brings better outcomes, and it's usually a huge time suck within a project. For this cabinet, I decided to not go with any hardware. Instead, I created some dados in the side of the cabinet that will walk on the drawers directly. This was both because not using hardware is a good way to save money on projects, but also because it would be a great practice to plan ahead and mark everything. And that is a second skill I think is great to practice on projects like this. Can you plan and mark everything correctly so that everything comes together as planned in the end? That is something that I've struggled with in the past, and I'm actively trying to get better at. For example here, I planned ahead and cut all my dados at once, before cutting back the size to final width. This ensured that the dados were in the same exact position from one side to the other. Something else I planned ahead here is that the sides of the cabinet were not going to be seen, but the top would, so I used this beautiful piece of cherry plywood for the top and later on the drawer fronts. I also added a 4-inch toe kick to this cabinet because that's what I usually do, but later on I would come to regret that decision. Because I don't want any screws to show through the top, I will use pocket holes to attach it to the rest of the cabinet. The rest of the frame will be assembled using brad nails and screws. Now, here's another skill I like to practice when doing scrap projects, and that is assembly. Assembling furniture and making sure everything is square and right where you want it can be a challenge sometimes. So I like to practice these skills on scrap projects. It's also a great opportunity to try different tools and different assembly methods and see what works best for you. Here, I am trying to use some homemade 90-degree clamps to pocket hole the top to the rest of the cabinet. I always struggle to align pocket holes correctly, and I think this was a great way to do it. I will definitely be using that in the future. After reinforcing the cabinet frame with some screws, I moved on to measuring and cutting all the parts for the drawers. Another skill that I got to practice during this build was building from actual measurements as opposed to math. Human error in measuring and cutting can add up pretty significantly in the end. So when building something like a slide-through drawer, I make sure to measure exactly the dimension to get the best possible fit. Once all my drawer bottoms were cut to size, I moved on to measuring and cutting the drawer boxes. During this process, I get to practice a fourth woodworking skill, which was setting up and doing repeated cuts. I used a mix of my table saw fans, as well as a sled, and different stop blocks to cut all those pieces to size. Now, if you're still watching and are liking this content, please consider subscribing to my channel and giving this video a like. It is a great source of motivation for me to continue making those videos in the future. The next step in the build was to assemble the drawer boxes, and here I am just using glue and brad nails. This cabinet will only be moderately used, so I'm not too worried about it coming apart over time. Once again, I refuse to trust myself and make sure that every part fit correctly before moving on to the next one. I followed the same process for all the drawer boxes. It was then time to add the drawer bottom to the drawer box. As you can see, the drawer bottom is slightly oversized compared to the drawer box. This makes the drawer bottom act like a drawer slide that will slide within the dados we created earlier. All you have to do is make sure that you have a consistent overhang across all sides. Once again, wood glue and bright nails here would be plenty of strength to hold those drawers together. And just like that, we had a cabinet with drawers. Now it was time to work on the aesthetic part of things. I will be adding a drawer face that is made out of cherry plywood that I used earlier for the top. After measuring everything, I cut a single piece of plywood as my drawer face using a mix of a track saw and my table saw. My goal here is to create all the drawer faces from this single piece of plywood that I will then cut to size with my track saw. This ensures that the grain looks continuous across all drawer faces. To attach the faces to the drawers, I find it useful to use double-sided tape as a temporary hold. Once I'm satisfied with the fit, I just press down on the drawer face and then can take the whole drawer out. I then secure the drawer face with countersunk screws. I then repeated the process for all drawer faces. And everything seemed perfect until, well, it wasn't. But that's a problem we're going to fix later. For now, let's make sure that no plywood edges are visible from the front by adding some edge bending to the cabinet body. Now, remember when I said that I would regret doing a 4-inch toe kick? Well, the problem here is that the cabinet is really shallow, so it tipped on me when all the drawers were inside. So here's the fifth woodworking skill you can practice, which is creative problem solving. Here, I just added a fake front to the cabinet and then added my cherry plywood on top. No one will ever know. And look at that, problem solved. Another problem I had to solve was figuring out what to use for drawer pulls since I did not want to use any hardware. Thankfully, I have buckets of offcuts that would make great drawer pulls. I even got to choose between using walnut or maple, and I think maple is the winner in that case. I then moved on to marking the locations of the holes I would need to drill to install those drawer pulls. I then used a little bit of CA glue to hold the drawer pull in place before screwing it to the frame. Now we had something that definitely looked like a cabinet. The last step was to apply finish, and here I'm using Rubio Monocoat that I had left from another project. I don't feel too bad for using such a fancy finish on a shop grade project, because Rubio goes bad after a few months, so I want to make sure that I use every single bit of it. Some paste wax will ensure a smooth gliding drawer. And before I knew it, I had a whole cabinet made only from plywood scraps. Remember that awkward space I talked about in my house? Well, this is the space between the sink and the wall in the guest bathroom. And up until now, I had a wire rack and a box that I haven't unpacked for a year. So this cabinet was definitely a huge upgrade for this space. And I think it turned out really well.